this annual opportunity to hear from leading thinkers in the wider world, and thank you for being with us here this evening, Julian. It was established in friendship between National Services Te Pairangi here at Te Papa and the Museum and Heritage Studies program at Victoria, established in honour of Michael's influence and him as a role model, I think, in thought and in change. And so it's equally lovely this evening in terms of friendship to be adding to that circle with Stephen Wainwright from Creative New Zealand. So all of us who inherit from Michael's work get to be in one room together. So Te Papa is extremely pleased to partner with Victoria University on what is now quite a long-standing initiative. And on that note, it's my happy privilege to invite Dr. Lee Davidson to the stage to introduce the lecture. If you could join me in welcoming Lee.
Thanks, Courtney. Thank you, everyone. Tēnā koutou katoa. Welcome, everyone, to the 2022 Michael Volkerling Memorial Lecture, The Arts as Vocation, National Cultural Policy Making at a Time of Precarious and Uncertain Everything. Before I introduce our esteemed speaker, Professor Julian Meyrick, I would like to acknowledge members of Michael's whānau who are present here this evening. Amelia, thanks for coming and sharing this evening with us. I had the privilege of being Michael's student in the late 1990s and then becoming his colleague when he established the Museum and Heritage Studies program at Victoria University in 2000. Michael has been described as one of the principal architects of New Zealand's cultural and creative sectors, and as you heard from that Courtney's short bio, it's a very impressive contribution that he's made. This year, we wanted to focus the lecture on the current state of cultural policy and the creative sector in Aotearoa as a way of honouring Michael's legacy in this area. Part of the context for our interest in this was a current initiative at Victoria University called Aotearoa, the Creative Fields Project, which aims to make visible and grow the university's collective expertise in the creative fields and to enhance its local, national and international leadership in this space. Over the last 12 months, there have been many discussions with colleagues and cultural sector leaders about the ways in which the university can collaborate internally and externally to make a greater contribution to Aotearoa's creative practices, policy making and cultural institutions. It became clear to me that what was required in terms of both our teaching and research was not just a focus on creative practice, but also a deep understanding and engagement with the cultural and political ecosystem in which creative practice takes place. In learning of recent developments with regards to a national cultural policy in Australia, my colleague Conal McCarthy and I felt it would be of great benefit to know more about what is happening across the ditch, as a way of reflecting on the current state of the sector and its future direction here in Aotearoa. And this is where tonight's speaker comes in. Dr. Julian Meyrick is Professor of Creative Arts at Griffith University and a renowned Australian theatre practitioner, cultural historian and policy activist. He was previously Strategic Professor of Creative Arts at Flinders University, as well as being a member of the Federal Government's Creative Australia Advisory Group from 2008 to 2010, and before that, Associate Director and Literary Advisor at the Melbourne Theatre Company. He has an interesting background as a political economist before he became involved in theatre. Australian theatre and drama is now his core area of expertise, and he's written the books Australian Theatre After the New Wave in 2017, and just recently this year published Australia in 50 Plays. At the same time, Julian frequently contributes to the national debate on Australian culture and cultural policy, including an impressive 90-plus articles for The Conversation. In 2013, he was asked to join a transdisciplinary research team looking at the problem of value in arts and culture, which led to the publication of a co-authored book, What Matters? Talking Value in Australian Culture, that roundly rejected a metrics-based approach to evaluation in the arts. Julian's somewhat uncommon breadth of experience across arts practice, academic research and cultural policy promises a lively, wide-ranging and insightful examination of the context of Australia's national cultural policy process, which will be followed by a panel of local speakers who will consider its implications for the glam and cultural sector in Aotearoa before we open up to Q&A. Before I pass over to Julian, I'd like to thank Te Papa, particularly Victoria and Mandy from National Services to Pairangi for their financial and organisational support, Conal McCarthy for his assistance in wrangling this evening together, and the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Te Herenga Waka, who also provided funding. It is now my great pleasure to invite Professor Meyrick to take the stage.
Thank you very much, Lee. I'm a theatre guy, so I can tell you that when I start talking, I'll talk for exactly 44 minutes. Just before I do, though, I just want to do a few thank yous of my own. First, I want to acknowledge that I wrote the lecture on the lands of the Yagamba and Kombumberi peoples in the Gold Coast and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I'd like to thank Victoria University of Wellington and the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tongaroa, for inviting me to give this talk, and in particular Lee, Conal and Mandy for managing the practicalities and offering wise advice. Has my lecture disappeared? Ha! That was not scripted.
45 minutes.
Yeah. And I would also like to offer my warm regards to the family of Michael Volkerling. I never met Michael. I was coming into the value research area at the moment of his untimely death. He was a highly influential figure, and not only in New Zealand. Some of the things that I will say tonight build on, and others contest the legacy of the research in which he was involved. But this reflects our different historical moments and not our different cultural commitments. Were he here tonight, I have no doubt in saying that he would be my perfect interlocutor. This is what you asked me to do. You're interested in understanding the process of developing a national cultural policy in Australia from the perspective of a practitioner, scholar, activist, that's basically me, to help us reflect on what New Zealand might learn from the Australian experience. And while some parts of New Zealand culture are recognised as creative industry, we're still grappling with how to articulate and demonstrate the value of the sector. So my father-in-law, Professor William McCarthy, a fine example of perdurable greymouth stone, was a pioneer in econometrics at the University of Lincoln in the 1970s. When I visit, I always let him know I hold him personally responsible for neoliberalism. At 95 years old, he is finishing what we are obliged to call his latest book on business communication. In it, he advises those who speak in public to begin with a story against themselves, to put their listeners on side. I published my first open letter on cultural policy in 1992. I have been involved in reading, analysing and contributing to cultural policy documents for 30 years. I have written 6 books and dozens of academic articles and media pieces that touch on different aspects of cultural policy making. I have lost no opportunity to relay my views to government or the sector. I have not changed the debate one jot, shifted one evaluation framework, or made any difference to the fate of any cultural organisation or artist. This is confronting to admit. Tonight I offer insights into the national cultural policy process underway in Australia. But to appreciate the moment we are in, we need an external point from which to take our bearings. I choose the 28th of January 1919, the date the German sociologist Max Weber gave his famous lecture, Politics as a Vocation, the title of which is echoed in my own, The Arts as a Vocation. Before explaining why I chose Weber's lecture as an orientation point, I should say that were he here listening to me complain, he would say, "What did I expect? What did I imagine politics to be?" Famously, he called them a slow boring through hard boards. So the expectation that engagement with policymaking will produce neat outcomes in the way that in a stage drama stories are resolved and characters get their due is not only an illusion, but one of the failed utopian imaginings of politics against which he so sternly warns. Rather than taking failure personally, a better tack is to see cultural policy as a common endeavour in which all contributions are subsumed and carried to a new destination by what Jean-Jacques Rousseau calls the general will. The hyper-individualism of the contemporary era is not useful here. Its preoccupation with thought leaders, pace-setters, influencers, gurus. What matters is the improvement cycle. The fate of one document is less important than whether we think we are heading towards or away from better understanding of the culture we are trying to have a policy about. This is a different measure of success, more forgiving yet more probing. It asks not for spotlit individual contribution, but honest collective self-assessment. There are parts of our lives where we do things just for ourselves and are judged accordingly. Cultural policy is not one of them. I joke that cultural policy is where artists go to support other artists whose work they do not particularly like. Weber delivered his lecture 39,930 days ago, allowing for the time change between Wellington and Munich. Reading it now is a humbling experience. Weber is intelligent, perceptive, and direct. Terrible violence characterized his moment. The workers' uprising in Berlin had been suppressed 2 weeks before, and one of its leaders, Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by right-wing thugs. For those who imagine the rise of the Nazis was a surprise, Weber told his listeners, "What lies before us is a polar night of icy darkness and harshness, whichever group may outwardly turn out the victor. When this night slowly begins to recede, how many will still be alive of all those for whom the spring had seemed to bloom so gloriously?" Focusing on the past as a series of discrete moments is an antidote to the obsessive nowism of the contemporary era, which remembers selectively when it remembers at all. 1919 must surely go down as one of the least successful years in human history. How many people can explain the causes of World War I, in which 30 million people died, or the Great Depression, whose economic and political conditions Western nations have been assiduously recreating in recent decades? I ask not to provoke, but to indicate how terrifying it is to lose the moral thread of our collective decision-making, to know that we did things, and even what we did, but not know why. The theme of Weber's lecture is politics as a life choice and mode of contribution to public affairs. It is a companion to his Science as a Vocation lecture, where he deals with the same topic in respect of academic knowledge. In both cases, he is not concerned with particular regimes or disciplines, but with politics and science as worldviews, offering special attraction for certain individuals, but conferring wider benefit when engaged for the common good. He uses the German word Beruf, or calling, which in the Lutheran tradition of Weber's background, though he was not a religious man, refers to serving God through earthly practices. Both lectures describe the kind of person who can be said to have a vocation in politics and science, and the kind of thinking and methods having one imposes. To have a vocation is to be called to a mission beyond the self, yet one that rewards the self to the extent that it can be sustained in that vocation. It is to be part of an imperfect, disappointing, difficult, collective enterprise in which fortitude and flexibility are key to achieving non-harmful ends. The political philosopher Wendy Brown writes that against the nihilism of the current era, Weber offers not hope, but grit. Above all, a vocation means being aware of the nature of the activity to which one is called, its promises and pitfalls, its sense of deeper purpose and identity. In the case of politics, this is provided by a relation to power, and three qualities a politician with a genuine vocation must possess: passion, a sense of responsibility, and a sense of proportion. My challenge tonight is this: what does it mean to think of the arts as a vocation? What provides cultural activities with their deeper purpose and identity? What qualities should we look for in those with a genuine vocation in the arts? I refer not only to artists, but to those who practice all manner of different roles in every part of the sector, whether the performing arts, communication media, or glam. Before answering these questions, I will touch on three topics. First, the last 50 years of Australian cultural policy as it has spluttered through a cycle of conceptual inadequacy, budgetary incapacity, and political mistiming. Problems now press on the cultural sector from all sides: governance, maintenance of infrastructure, programme sustainability, and social expectations. We can add the ubiquitous adapting to change, though that battered phrase is used to label everything from tweaking grant procedures to responding to climate catastrophe. We live at the super-soluble end of liquid modernity, where there are few points of continuity. Everything is in flux, always. When change is constant and open-ended, it no longer provides a point of concrete aspiration. So I will avoid prophetic utterances about history with a capital H and being on the right or wrong side of it. We are where we are. The question is not what will happen in the future. The question is, what should we do now to make the future we want to see? I will also briefly compare Australia's journey with international cultural policy and the UN's current interest in what it calls global public goods. The activist aim is to see culture become the 18th UN Sustainable Development Goal. I draw on the work of my colleague Justin O'Connor to sketch the timeline and trends of this trajectory, which involves tensions between global north and global south, concepts of tangible and intangible heritage, culture as turbocharged driver of economic development, and a sliding of the word creativity from quality of cultural practice to ingredient in the product innovation cycle. As the Washington Consensus disintegrates further in the face of another global downturn, culture emerges as a point of redress. Previously lost in a thicket of jobs and growth statistics showing its returns to deindustrialised, low productivity service economies, culture steps forward with a mitigating social role to play. Thus far, this policy narrative isn't very evolved, at least in Australia. There is discussion of culture in relation to health, well-being, and community cohesion. It can go much further, however, and have universal embrace. As Justin said recently to a conference on policy reform, to change cultural policy is to change the world. Finally, I offer remarks on my own area of expertise, evaluation methodologies. For a decade now, I have been studying approaches to measuring art and culture that are overblown, under-contextualised, politically oblivious, or frankly absurd. The belief in the ability of data to inform evidence-based policymaking looked dubious when I started. Today, it looks fantastical. This does not mean that data and evidence have no role to play in cultural policy. It means the scope of their authority and what philosophers call their veridical truth is more limited than we typically suppose. But to come between a cultural organisation and its proofs of worth is to come between a drunk and a bottle. Reason flies out the window, replaced by a gaggle of conflicting justifications that Sigmund Freud dubbed cattle logic. The data is incomplete but better than nothing, is methodologically bogus but politically necessary, won't be accepted, must be seen to be gathered, and so on. These topics are interlinked. The history of Australian cultural policy is the history of a failure to develop appropriate value methodologies. It is also its failure to accept the cultural responsibilities associated with several important international agreements. Meanwhile, in the debate between global north and global south, post-colonial nations like Australia, New Zealand, and Canada show characteristics of both camps and might be described as economically developed but culturally fragile. As their settlement histories have come back to haunt them, their identities as branch cultures of a once imperial power prove increasingly unsatisfactory. What can Australia offer international cultural policy mediated through its own national experience? What can we all learn from broader discussion about better evaluation methods upon which cultural activities are propped like a wobbly tabletop. So this table brings together two different horizons of cultural policy making. In blue ink are the major cultural policies of the Australian government from 1976 to now. In red ink are the international ones over the same period. I put dates, titles and authors, etc. in separate columns. Perhaps the most intriguing is rhetorical style. Voice in cultural policy is a decisive factor. It influences not only the distribution of scarce resources to organisations and individual artists, but the meaning of that support, what is conferred by way of public purpose and expectations. These are always particular, never generic. Cultural policies are neither iterative nor interchangeable. A health or education policy developed for Finland or South Korea might share similarities with one for Australia or New Zealand. That is starkly untrue of a cultural policy, and not only on the level of content. The entire outlook of the document will reflect a distinctive understanding of the world and of being in it. This is what makes talk of global standards and international benchmarks in respect of cultural policy nonsensical. However, there are points of comparison if we match like with like and are careful interpreting the results. So the blue and red rows do offer insights. What might these be? A main one is that Australia is an early adopter of a neoliberal view of culture, though it was more likely to be called economic rationalist when Donald Horne coined that term in 1976 to describe members of Gough Whitlam's government with an elective affinity for free market economics. The Industries Assistance Commission is the predecessor to today's Productivity Commission. I have carefully examined the assistance to the Performing Arts report. Its framing of arts and culture as consumer goods, best left to unregulated markets to provide, is a rhetorical strain in cultural policy never repudiated thereafter. The Parliamentary Micheal report in 1986, which announced multi-year funding for major cultural organisations, and Creative Nation in 1994, which united the ministerial portfolios of communications and the arts, reproduced the IAC's economic keystoning and its market-first approach. Creative Nation is usually remembered for what I call its grand national vision. However, it is its positioning of culture as a driver of the economy that proved internationally influential. Advisors to Tony Blair, about to fight an election in Britain, took note of Australia's national cultural policy, the first of its kind. They fed it into a creative economy paradigm that was part of a third way agenda which transformed UK Labour into what Wikipedia, not noted for its partisan language, calls effectively a new centre-right and neoliberal party. Creative Australia in 2013 was in place only for a few months, and so its impact is hard to judge. As befits a country implicated in the global financial crisis but slow to feel its effects, the economism of previous documents is muted. In this policy, markets play a decisive role in managing culture, but governments play a decisive role in managing markets. Its rhetorical style is technocratic. In the 9 years of coalition rule from October 2013 to May 22, no cultural policy of consequence was enacted. You have to go back to the 1950s when having a cultural policy was equated with communism to find similar official inertia. The international trajectory is a little different. The Mexico Conference of 1982, drawing on a string of regional conferences in the previous decade, advocated for culture on grounds of regional equity, social diversity, and national identity. Culture is a matter of legal rights, not market provision, a civilizational counterweight to the avidity of global economic expansion. This prompted a UNESCO-sponsored Decade of Cultural Development in the 1990s, fed by awareness of the uneven pace of economic development across northern and southern hemispheres, a resurgent capitalist West and a newly non-socialist East. It culminated in the Universal Declaration of Cultural Diversity in 2001. From 2005 onwards, the creative economy paradigm, migrating from Britain across the globe, spread the idea that culture is not a palliative to economic development, but a powerful driver of it. After the GFC, these policies also acquired a technocratic flavour, with governments priming their creative industries to prime their broader economies. Justin O'Connor writes, "In the new paradigm, there was no contradiction between culture and economy, and no need to seek balance or even protection. What was good for the economy was good for culture. Win-win. But the expansion of global cultural trade has not floated all boats. Developing countries face formidable challenges which cannot be wished away in the rush to positive advocacy. The global north has first mover advantages in the 1980s, saw a massive expansion of global communications infrastructure with high degrees of concentration there. Everybody might be creative, but that does not mean they all equally have the means to thrive in a local creative economy." The intersection with Australian cultural policy is not only the equating of arts and culture with its economic impacts. That would be an easy mistake to fix. It lies in the collusion of the creative economy with the wider economisation of daily life that is the chief feature of neoliberalism. Post-COVID, however, the focus of international cultural policy has swung back to the 1982 Mexico Conference. The recent Mondiacult Final Declaration reaffirms the principles of equity, diversity and identity put forward 40 years ago. It is unclear what Australia's next national cultural policy will say. Can it escape the pull of its neoliberal past? Hopefully it can, though the contrast in tone in some early statements with the Mondiacult Declaration is striking. I won't define neoliberalism or defend my use of the term. There is a substantial body of scholarship around it from a variety of disciplinary perspectives. The point is that in Australian cultural policy making, there are persistent neoliberal tendencies that compromise it in significant ways. In cultural policies, there is always more than one rhetorical strain involved. It is not a question of choosing between intrinsic and extrinsic goals. A nation will always want both. But which strain is dominant is crucial. When I was a child and had to make a promise I didn't want to keep, I would cross my fingers behind my back. Think of these strains as neoliberalism's equivalent of that behaviour. The first rhetorical strain is a consumerist conception of value. It is important those working in the arts understand this is the lens through which their work is judged. The economist Mariana Mazzucato addresses the problem in her 2017 book, The Value of Everything, the first half of which is a historical account of theories of value in modern economics. The key event is the so-called marginalist revolution of the late 19th century. Until this time, value was associated with the labour that went into making capital productive, the labour theory of value. Marginalist economics, which is modern economics, transposed it to the point of market exchange and made it identical to consumer choice. The value of a product is equated with its price. A number of different ideas are swept into one box. Utility, preference, benefit and scarcity are terms with different meanings and implications. Modern economics conflates them all, just as it conflates under conditions of market equilibrium what is feasible with what is desirable. It calls the result value, and in so doing renders the concept entirely subjective. Anything consumers will pay for is of value, in direct proportion to the price it will fetch. Mazzucato comments that defining everything that commands a price as valuable led to the conclusion that what you get is what you're worth. Profits are not determined by exploitation, but by technology and the marginal product of capital. This view diverted attention from the tensions between capital and labour, and ultimately from alternative theories on the sources and distribution of value. The neoclassical theory of value has not changed much in the last 100 years. On the basis of contemporary economic assumptions, we can no longer reliably say who creates value and who extracts it, and therefore how the proceeds of production, income, should reasonably be distributed. Modern economics empties the concept of value of substantive meaning. In its place, it puts a mathematical theory of consumer preferences. If you work for a glam organisation, read Mazzucato's book. Next time you are faced with a spreadsheet of spectators, readers, eyeballs, footfalls, pause before assuming these numbers reflect the value of the cultural activity in question. Believing they do is the result of 100 years of indoctrination around an impoverished concept of value, motivated by a desire to avoid the difficult choices involved if the problem is faced in its full intellectual complexity. The second rhetorical strain is a disinstitutionalizing one. In part, this flows from a consumerist concept of value, though it also has its own unique origins. These lie in what Weber calls monocratic, bureaucratic administration. If the benefit to the consumer is the totality of value, it is only logical that all prior steps to providing that benefit are seen as costs to be minimised or eliminated. The market mechanism is a delivery mechanism. It has no value in itself. Its institutions are divisible sets of functions that can and should be rearranged to ensure maximum value is provided, i.e., the greatest ratio of cost to benefits reflected in market prices as perceived by consumers. If you can detect here the spectral justification of 100,000 organisational restructures to come, you'd be right. Institutions are fluid and divisible, and the goods and services they provide are substitutes for each other. Not only do cultural organisations compete against smarter, leaner organisations, they compete against all other activities consumers might conceivably do by way of gaining an analogous benefit. Culture, like anything else, like everything else, is infinitely replaceable. In case you think I'm exaggerating for the purposes of argument, consider this passage in the IAC's Assistance to the Performing Arts report. Much of the evidence received assumed that certain art forms and activities are primarily cultural ends in themselves, rather than mainly means to cultural ends. The performing arts provide psychological, emotional, or intellectual stimulation and other forms of personal satisfaction to individuals. However, these do not of themselves justify public assistance. There are many other activities which serve the same purpose. These include reading and a growing number of alternatives such as cinema, foreign travel, and sporting and recreational facilities. Once government assistance can be claimed for entertainment, the drain on resources would be endless. So a number of rotten eggs are gathered in this basket, including the assumption that market provision is best and customers never wrong. However, it is the mood of obdurate scepticism, putting cultural institutions on the back foot for being such, that is so familiar to the Australian cultural sector. In a disinstitutionalised view of value, it is the job of cultural organisations to convince policymakers why they should exist. The term for this is instrumentalism, and like the consumerist concept of value, it robs policy making of substance. In this case, it is debate about policy ends, what the Chinese call the other side of the river. Instrumental policy making is always looking to swap out for alternatives that are more beneficial or cheaper, or more beneficial because they're cheaper, while organisations are reduced to minimal agency, the platform. Nothing has value, it only provides it. And that includes all institutions, histories, communities, and social groups. Everything is a means to an end. As discussion about means under neoliberalism becomes rigid and ideological, discussion of policy ends is neglected or dismissed as a matter of individual choice. But there are no swap-outs for certain things. When human action lays waste the natural environment, there is nothing that can replace it, and we know it. We then face debate about what Weber calls ultimate values. In monocratic, bureaucratic, administrative states, which have been disenchanted by a loss of religious faith and robbed of their capacity for meaning-making by rational science, politics is the arena for managing the resulting value pluralism. In his vocation lecture, Weber emphasises the fateful nature of modern politics. He insists on an ethic of responsibility, contrasting it with an ethic of conviction. It is not that politicians should lack principles, it is that they are personally accountable for the consequences when these are pursued, because it is politics which arbitrates what value finally means. Weber is correct. No efficiency algorithm can decide between different social uses of the same resources, though it may contribute to their framing. It is a category mistake to imagine that a policy's authority emerges from the validity of its evidence. It is the other way round. Proof is always proof to someone. Data is rejectable unless there is an underlying social process that confers on it shared meaning, significance, and truth. Cultural policy is therefore not beyond politics. It is inherently political. Any attempt to rule it off from politics only entrenches the cultural order in place when that ruling off occurs. What we want from a cultural policy, including its evaluation strategies, is a real cultural politics, one that can participate in and contribute to a debate about culture's purpose and ultimate values. The final rhetorical strain reflects the national narrative in which Australian cultural policy has been implicated for half a century. The glam and art sector like to draw its identity from its singular nature. Whether celebrated or decried, it thinks of itself as the cultural exception. I have no doubt that culture is special, but the story of Australian cultural policy under neoliberalism is depressingly similar to other domains. Starting with the abolition of tariff protections in the 1970s, Australia embraced a market-first approach, not only to its economy, but to society. Deindustrialisation followed in the 1980s and 1990s in the wake of the adoption of the doctrine of comparative advantage. This was accompanied by abolitions of controls on currency and share markets, leading to a derivatives trading boom and the underinvestment in productive capital that comes with financialisation. Reductions in social welfare programs and privatisation of public assets after the coalition came to power in 1996 further undermined the ideas of public value and public good that drove the post-war Keynesian consensus around a just society. Above all, there was insistence on the primacy of the individual as the atomic unit of the nation, Margaret Thatcher's "there is no such thing as society," and the instilling of a principle of competition in all areas of collective life. Social thinker Anna Yateman writes, "Competition policy is the quintessential expression of the economic imperialism of neoliberal thought. The effect is to cancel the distinction between public and private sectors, thereby bringing about a situation where the nature of publicness can be neither talked about nor comprehended." Today, there is a growing awareness neoliberalism has failed to deliver. New industries have not sprung up to replace those allowed to go to the wall. Income inequality has not reduced, as the Kuznets curve spuriously claimed. Wealth inequality even less so. The abandonment of full employment consigns a section of the population to either perpetual unemployment or penurious underemployment, a figure between 3 and 10%. Yet far from ameliorating this outcome of its policy choices by using wealth transfers, the Australian government has done the opposite, blamed the disadvantaged for their own condition in a gobsmacking act of psychological displacement. I'm sounding like a political activist. I am only an artist trying to work out what happened to cultural policy. The national narrative involves very negative outcomes for decisions taken by a small elite, first in response to the stagflation of the 1970s and the fear of the loss of Western economic supremacy, second to the end of the Cold War in the 1990s and the capitalist triumphalism this unleashed. All good things come to an end sooner or later. Bad things too. The GFC, Brexit, the rise of authoritarian regimes in Europe and Asia, the social disarray of the US and the UK, the diplomatic brinkmanship of Russia and China, the global pandemic. It is so over, this neoliberal story. Now Australia faces what everyone faces after they have made a string of bad decisions, the consequences. In cultural policy, we need an analysis not only of what governments have done in the arts, but what they have done to them. Debates about funding have been rendered viciously redistributive. It is always artist against artist, institution against institution, art form against art form. Weber writes that modern policymaking replaces loyalty to persons with fidelity to norms. Administrative decisions have a disembodied quality. Unlike political ones, they are not readily contested or defied. They are the perfect place to hide bias in a process that might be labelled power laundering. Raw power goes in one end, seemingly neutral decisions come out the other. All the social and historical features of culture, expressed in customs and beliefs, institutions and communities of practice, in intergenerational memories, craft transmission, and distinctive collective national features, are dissolved within a mode of data-fied policy making whose politically troubling features are buried deep within bureaucratic protocols. Averages, aggregates, weightings, confected formulae, and variables. These are the tricks of mainstream economics since Alfred Marshall tried to claim for it the mantle of science by adopting the mathematics Isaac Newton used for the laws of physics. The value produced by numerical quantification masks the values imposed by underlying assumptions. The methods are powerful and imperializing, insisting on the accountability of those they entangle. Yet it is a rare day when they are held to account themselves. It is this baffling asymmetry that is so draining to contend with for those in the cultural sector. Monocratic bureaucratic administration is antipathetic to all forms of what we call traditional knowledge, where historically particular orders of understanding are at stake. Who speaks, when, how, and why are questions vital in such communities, but to which Weber's system of rationalising rule are indifferent or hostile. How can we find a better way of making cultural policy? The first step, as in an AA meeting, is to give up trying to control culture and let it talk for itself. The era of unbridled data speak must be brought to a close. The question for the future, for a future we might want to see, is what should replace it? Cultural policies have been handed in like homework and handed down like court judgments. They have been launched like space rockets and ocean liners. Now they are dropped, which says a lot about the mood of the contemporary moment. Going forwards, as politicians like to say, as if it were possible through some temporal glitch to go sideways or even backwards. Everyday metaphors tell us a lot about how we are feeling, but keep out of awareness. Like undercarpet, they sit beneath our conscious minds, shaping our opinions and dispositions. This is what it means to live in uncertain times, when even our language radiates unease and instability. To change the government, Paul Keating remarked, is to change the nation. The coming to power of federal Labour this year in Australia brought with it an instant switch of policy focus, at least on the surface. Both during the election and afterwards, Prime Minister Albanese made clear his intention to formally accept the 2017 Uluru Statement of the Heart and recognise the sovereignty of First Nations people over the land that today we call Australia. This has provided new impetus to the Voice, Treaty and Truth process as Australians head towards a plebiscite on constitutional change. I am not a First Nations artist, nor do I speak for them. The Makarrata process includes many perspectives and some core disagreements. It is likely that progress will be slow and difficult to achieve. Again, Weber would say, that's politics. When ultimate values are at stake, political contestation is unavoidable. Key to recognising the rights and role of First Nations people, however, is recognising their culture. This is the heart of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, which includes these words. We seek constitutional reforms to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our destiny, our children will flourish. They will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. To say it again, you cannot solve a political problem with a measurement methodology, however ingenious. And the problems the Australian nation faces right now are all political. It is being dragged back to its past to review its crimes, disasters, misjudgments and mistakes. Part of the issue is that there is no language to talk about the meaning of culture and its substantive value on a policy level, because this type of understanding has not been promoted on a political one. Yet there is no way to manage First Nations culture with the blunt tools of cost-benefit analysis, nor is a swap-out to a cheaper option available. If non-Indigenous Australians do not wish to consume First Nations art, it will be hard for policymakers to argue that therefore it is of no value. The conjunction of our moment is the opposition of a neoliberal logic of calculative value and the fury, frustration and hope of social values in all their plurality and enflamed lostness. If today public debate over values sometimes feels shrill, disrespectful and not a little narcissistic, it is because it has been cast out of the arena of rational policy agreement and banished to a grim realm of ceaseless sectional antagonism. To be clear, First Nations culture is not a resource for Western governments to address the chronic problems of late modernity. It is not yet another thing to be extracted. It is a life world and a history to be respected. Yet the disjunction between the sense of value that emerges from First Nations ideas of and talk around arts and culture and the hyper-instrumentalised, pseudo-methodic, self-alienated, disorganic conceptions imposed by the frameworks of Western countries like Australia is so profound they can only be at odds with each other. Australia's next national cultural policy needs a completely new language of value, and if it does not generate a genuine cultural politics, if it continues to present the choices of power as the outcomes of administrative processes, it will fail. If it empowers ministers and politicians at the expense of practitioners and arts organisations in governance and decision-making, it will fail. If it does not find a better balance between producers and consumers in its conception of value and its evaluation methodologies, it will fail. If it does not attract increased investment into the cultural sector to shift funding out of a Hunger Games redistribution mentality, it will fail. If it does not resuscitate concepts of public good and public value and make these key to a policy framework that can robustly confront the neoliberal doxa of more for less, it will fail. If it does not speak with a knowledgeable, inclusive and trustworthy voice to the Australian nation it aims to reflect, both in respect of the checkered past of the nation and the just future for which we all should strive, it will fail. The arts as a vocation. Not a leisure activity, market choice or means of employment, a business venture or a platform for innovation, though it may be all those things as well, but something serious, principled and binding, a call. If we accept that science and politics are vocations in the way that Weber describes, how does it change our understanding of cultural policy to see the arts as operating with the same inner imperative? It changes it completely. It changes its tone, aims and outcomes. Most especially, it changes its meaning. If politics is defined by a particular and unavoidable relation to power and science to knowledge, then art is defined by a relation to the imagination. What are the qualities that define a vocation in the arts? Following Weber, I will name three. First, for arts and culture, there is no thinking outside the box because there is no box. The practitioner must go wherever, whenever their art and art form leads them, however difficult, inconvenient or risky, an absolute liberty of soul. Second, a willingness to give your art to whoever wants it without reservation or exclusion, an implicit universality of address. What I am describing here are not the personal virtues of every cultural practitioner. They are structural features of the vocation itself, dimensions of what Weber would call its ideal type. They are called into being by choice of profession, so that if you are not particularly courageous or generous, and I would fit both those categories, then a life in arts and culture will require them from you. imaginative freedom will be demanded, as will a maximum orbit of communication. For who is a poem for, if not for anyone who can read it? A painting, if not for anyone who can see it? A song, if not for anyone who can hear it? A drama, if not for anyone willing to open themselves to its worlds-making transformations? The third quality is this: art is always personal. Arts practitioners do not lead others like politicians or study discrete bodies of knowledge like scholars. They are their own political party, their own scientific experiment. They advance their work as a case of one, looking to connect with a broader feeling, debate, or condition. In speaking for themselves, they seek to speak for a larger view, at a minimum for anyone who thinks or feels as they do. A vocation in the arts is an insertion of the self into the world on an intersubjective, not merely subjective level. Because the practitioner advances in their individual self, looking, hoping, but unsure of this resonant connection, they are always indefeasibly and unrescuably vulnerable. It is this that infuses cultural work with its high-touch, magnificent humanity and makes it personal. Taken together, these qualities shape what Germans would call a Zweck, which in English is a word that hovers between goal and purpose. It is at once non-instrumental and practical. It is not about satisfying criteria or fulfilling a list. It is a rationale for pursuing a course of action in light of a higher end. To have a vocation in the arts is to be called to a Zweck with the qualities I have described for a life in service to the imagination in its public role. This moment, this unreadable moment we are in, so fractured and frightened. Something has come to an end, certainly. But it is not necessary to invest that with tragic fervour, to see the end of everything in the end of something, to accept we face not just new choices, but new kinds of choices. Economistic asocial policy settings will be less effective going forwards, both domestically and internationally. The conceptual impoverishment and instrumentalisation of cultural policy constrains and disparages the visionary contribution arts and culture can make. For they are our generator of alternative choices par excellence. And their activities and offerings, from soap opera to grand opera, stand-up comedy to Shakespeare, fulfills this deep need of the human soul. Imagination is the key to their doing so, and it is imagination we need right now to break the downward spiral into which we are locked and make a future we want to see. Wendy Brown, who discerns in neoliberalism's obsessive calculating the dark hue of political nihilism, writes, "We cannot cling to the belief that either reason or interest will awaken those lured or soothed by authoritarian plutocrats. We cannot expect to recruit through rational argument or evidence that a Trump or a Bolsonaro are exploiting fears and resentments and burning all of our children's futures. Rather, our task is to kindle desire for a just, livable, sustainable world. This is a cultural project. It is significant that the right has worked for decades at this level, in schools, churches, civic associations, media, and more. The left, not so much." As Max Weber faced his moment, so we must face ours. Though no one knew it in 1919, Europe had 10 years to solve the problems that caused and came out of World War I. It failed to do it, and so repeated the catastrophe on a larger scale. How long do we have before our problems overwhelm us? Let us treat the idea of a vocation in either politics, science, or the arts with the utmost gravity then, and pay heed to the closing words of Weber's lecture. It is absolutely true, and our entire historical experience confirms it, that what is possible could never have been accomplished unless people had tried again and again to achieve the impossible. Even those who are neither leaders nor heroes must arm themselves with that staunchness of heart that refuses to be daunted by the collapse of all their hopes. for otherwise they will not be capable of accomplishing what is possible today. I can think of no better rationale for a national cultural policy than this, that it aims to make the impossible possible in art, so it may inspire us to make the impossible possible in our world. Thank you. I think we're going to do a bit of a Q&A now, so we'll bring some chairs up. And that's my father-in-law, the Greymouth Stone.
Thank you, Julian, for that very powerful and masterful articulation of this particular moment. I'm now going to hand over to Stephen Wainwright to respond to Julian's lecture. Stephen, of course, is the Chief Executive of Creative New Zealand, and he is actually a Victoria University graduate, I discovered, with a Bachelor of Arts and a Bachelor of Commerce and Administration. He joined Creative New Zealand in 1990 and has been involved in strategic and business planning for many years and worked closely with the country's leading arts organisations. He became a member of CNZ's senior management team in 2002 as Manager of Arts Infrastructure Services and later Acting Chief Executive before being appointed Chief Executive in 2008.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou. Hello, everybody. Thank you for that very stimulating lecture. As you were showing the slides about cultural policy and so on, I got to thinking about perhaps some of the differences between New Zealand and other countries. And Gisela will remember more than me, but I'm thinking back to cultural policy, I suppose, in the 1990s, and Micheal, of course, was a powerful force in the 1980s. And I remember Chris Finlayson talking actually at the Featherston Book Fair, and he was trying to summarise one of the intangible things which makes New Zealand different from Australia. And I was struck by the number of policies, chuk. And in New Zealand, I was going, let's think about something really, really important. Energy policy, right? There's a lot of talk about, very important things like global warming. So, you'd think you'd want an energy policy that would enable you to confidently say, this is our response to this big thing. We don't have an energy policy in New Zealand. Think about our settings here and the importance of Te Treaty, which all of us in the cultural world are very mindful of, and we all do our best in our own way to give effect of it. You kind of go, jeepers, wouldn't it be helpful if there was like a national treaty policy? Because that would tell us that mattered, and we had a plan. Oh, hell, we don't have one of those. And so what I'm struck by is the dissonance, I guess, between some other jurisdictions and the way we roll. And when the pink team came into power, I think a lot of people were quite optimistic about the possibilities that, the obvious support for culture and the arts might manifest itself in a cultural policy that would be the summation of our dreams. And of course that hasn't happened. And we should not be surprised it hasn't happened, because it's never happened. And it hasn't only never happened for culture, it's never happened for most important things, like energy, like the treaty, because that's not the way that New Zealand rolls. And so in the absence of that national top-down kind of, I would say slightly old-fashioned leadership, what are we left to do then as the cultural sector? And in fact, from my point of view, the most exciting and interesting cultural policy is in fact cultural policy that is led and developed by cultural institutions. Now, the trouble with that is that we're left with a void. And I think you touched on some of the things at the heart of that void, Julian. So I know a little bit about, so what New Zealand does is it does tactics. So, we want to have more Maori content on television or in the movies. We'll create an entity that develops Maori content. Nothing wrong with that, it's a great tactic. But that doesn't sit in anything bigger than our response to achieve one thing. And the bit that's missing from that, which I think is a really important thing which you identified for us, Julian, is that there's no kind of shared currency about what sits behind it all. What do I mean by that? So the well-being discussion should have been our golden moment, right? It should have been that, because it was repositioning value. So we all know, everyone knows, GDP is a very limiting articulation of success for a nation, and we were told well-being budgets, don't worry, we've got these other ideas that we all know matter. We want to have an environment where we can swim in a river. So environment, that's important, cultural well-being, social well-being, great. But what happened with that? Not much, right? So what's been interesting, Mondia Cult, that was a discussion led by the International Federation for Arts, Council and Cultural Organisations, IFICA, which I used to be part of, and we're a member. And what is interesting about that is that they're pushing for a rights-based approach, right? So what I'm talking about is philosophically, we haven't landed on where we stand. And the advantage of a rights-based approach is that it goes to both sides of the river. So we all know that to have an aspiration to be a creative practitioner in New Zealand is enormously hard. All the evidence points to that. We know that from the stories from our friends who work in the sector. But the thing about a rights-based approach is that it enables you to say, if we have agreed that citizens have a right to access their culture and the arts, then there must be a mutual obligation from a rights perspective to support those who create those opportunities. So if we were to agree philosophically that that was like our point of view, for example, that would be a tremendously powerful lever. Because if you look at the legislation of most of the public good entities created in New Zealand in the past 20 or 30 years, organisations like Creative New Zealand, like the Film Commission, even like Te Manga Paho, if you look at the legislation, you will see that kind of embedded in that is a manufacturing industrial logic. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is that they're kind of manufacturing models where what the Act talks about is generate activity that the public will enjoy equals public good, job done, right? And what's missing in all of those bits of legislation is the vocation of the creative practitioner and the centrality of support for that person. So the point of what I'm trying to articulate is that we're a little bit morally adrift because we don't have our feet firmly rooted on the ground here philosophically. And I think, as you touched on, Julian, a different worldview is probably the lever to think through to reposition value that's very human-centric and probably imbued by richer ideas about identity and meaning than comes from that Western bureaucratic Weberian manufacturing logic. So there's a few thoughts that I have in terms of your very engaging. It took me back to my public administration days. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen, for making those connections and thinking about the implications for New Zealand. Julian, would you like to respond?
Oh, you're right. No, I often feel, particularly when I meet senior arts bureaucrats or arts politicians, and they look at me and they go, "Oh, he's so nice and clean," and then I start speaking, and they're like, "Oh my God, get him out of the room." The message is quite a tough one, but it's not really my message. It's just the record. That's what it is. I'm just pointing out really what has happened, and your beautiful metaphor of what's underneath. I think if Michael Volkerling were here, he would kind of go, the problem of value in my team, we call it a gateway problem. It's a problem that you have to solve to get to any other problem. And if you don't have a substantive sense of value, then you fall back on your tactical priorities of the day. And they may be okay for a bit, but usually they have a pretty short shelf life. So you then end up, Australia has ended up, with working cultural strategies that are really for a completely different decade. And that's what we have to think our way out of now.
Thank you. Did you want to make any further comments?
Only that I think there's room for cautious optimism in terms of perhaps some of it's been amplified by the whole COVID experience, I think, and that some of the things about our society which you touched on, Julian, are now coming through in academia in particular. So there's a chap from Harvard who teaches at the Kennedy School of Government who's come to New Zealand a few times. He's an absolute genius. His name is Professor Mark Moore. Some of you may have heard of him. And his whole shtick is public value. And I had the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to spend a bit of time with him. And I must say, for me, it was a real kind of slap in the face about the blinkers that I didn't know that I had. And the key thing from that really was that he said, if you're a public institution, then in your mandate you'll have all. It'll be all new. So if you're regional, it might be all Wellingtonians, or if you're national, it'll be all New Zealanders. But there'll be an all there somewhere, right? And he would say, now I want you to think about how much time you and the executive team or your board think about the finances. Just log that in your head. And I want you to think about how much time you spend thinking about effectiveness and efficiency in terms of delivering what your organisation delivers. Log that. And everyone's going, oh, yeah, we have those discussions. Oh, yeah, we've got measures. Yeah, good. He says, okay, so that's one side of public value. It's an important thing, right? Because it's taxpayers' money and you want to spend it wisely and all that. So that's solid, do that work. So the other side of that coin, justice and fairness. Have a little think about how much time have you and your senior team and your board spent making sense of those terms, justice and fairness. There's this gaping, Can you have a noisy gaping silence? I don't know. But there was something akin to that in the room of all these, people who are doing big jobs in big organisations. And he was saying, as you were saying, Julian, that until you can balance those two things, we will all be failing. And so I think that for me was a really important message, which has made us think much harder and do some things, wouldn't say we're there yet, whoever is, to really shift the dial somewhat on the inherent imbalances in our society. And as I say, I think it's really unlikely, because it's, I was thinking of Ai Weiwei actually, and that great slogan he has that everything is art, everything is politics, right? So I think most of these decisions are actually too hard to expect politicians to handle. And it's nice to think that they might, but I've never seen that in New Zealand's history. Even when Helen Clark came in with what was amongst the biggest moments in our cultural landscape with the cultural recovery package, it wasn't driven by any clear policy. It was driven from that very Kiwi thing, Houston, we've got a problem, we've got to fix the problem, otherwise I'll look bad, right? So that's a very practical form of policy making. But that was what was done. And in fact, I can't really think of anything comparable since then. And so I'm not personally optimistic that it's going to happen top down. I think it's up to us to do it more bottom up.
Thank you, Stephen. Yes, they are difficult and often uncomfortable questions. I'd like to open up to the audience now to see if we've got some questions from the floor that both Julian and Stephen can respond to.
Kia ora koutou. Gisela Carr. I've worked in various cultural institutions over the course of my career, and I must say, first off, as a personal friend of Michael Volkerling's and a colleague of his, gosh, how amazing to be taken to a place that Michael took us to, which is into an intellectual discussion about cultural policy, because and I have to meet you, Stephen, for your remarks also. That's a very rare experience in New Zealand. It's a profoundly anti-intellectual country in its Pākehā aspects, and something Michael did was create this kind of discourse, which I, for one, am experiencing as a kind of intensity tonight. And I'd just like to make a couple of observations, really. One is what you said provides such food for thought, as does Stephen's remarks, that I hope Lee will have an opportunity to have a copy of this so that we can think about it, because I don't pretend to digest and really fully think through what you were saying in every regard. But as someone who's donned various policy frocks throughout my career, and learnt various languages in my career in which to articulate the case for the arts, be that creative cities, be it, I can remember a 3-hour debate at Creative New Zealand about whether we supported or invested in the arts. Your question about voice and tone, absolutely that is borne out in my experience. And there is no capacity, I think, to create the kind of reflection in roles where we are actually enacting some of these decisions, where you're having to decide where funding goes, or we're seeking funding, or we're trying to drive an understanding of what the wider applications might be. There's very little capacity to think about, could we organise this in a different way and think this through in a different way? As we see neoliberalism ending, where might we take our collective energies is something out of your talk I really want to think about. My experience, though, in the last 5 years, and particularly in the last 2 years, has been that I'm increasingly struck by how Western cultural administration feels bankrupt and a busted flush, and that real moral authority in this area is shifting to Māori. In fact, I think it's always been with Māori, but now we are seeing it, at least we're making space for it. And in the forums I'm in, that statement closer to your UNESCO and your Mexican statements is coming out of collective cultural practice and the belief systems of Māori, and where we Pākehā are wandering in some abyss, I think. So where to go from here, that needs some thought, but I'm really struck by your suggestion that what we need are cultural politics of some complexity and quality. I mean, of course we need more investment, of course we need different kinds of level of discourse, but the notion that we might be able to organise ourselves differently to drive a sense of value and to build that just, inclusive, fair society, to have our boards consider what justice and fairness look like, that seems to me to be absolutely a mine a seam that could be mined, and that's certainly one of the things I'll be taking away. So thank you very much.
You've said so many important things. I think something similar is happening in Australia, perhaps not in the same way in terms of the moral and cultural authority passing to First Nations artists in particular. I feel like I've seen that all this year. And I wouldn't say I knew it was going to happen because that's glib and stupid, but I knew that what I was looking at sometime in detail was not sustainable because it had no moral ground. So it was just going to, fall over at a touch because it was a series of techniques masquerading as a series of organising policy principles. Just in terms of, like where we go next, I don't spend all of my time making high-toned statements. Sometimes I just look at practical things. And the last piece that I wrote for Arts Hub was about practitioner representation on boards, accountability processes. So when I was a young practitioner, I sat on at least 3 boards. And it was kind of an expected part of the, that's what you did. You did your shows and then you sat on some board. In the 1990s and into the 2000s, practitioners were increasingly removed from boards. And then last year, I don't know if you followed this in the media here, but Circus Oz, which is a very well-known, it broke down because the board wanted to remove the artists from its governing council. And that was A, disgraceful in itself, B, it is traditionally an artist-controlled company, so what did they think they were doing? But 3, also an indication of long-term trends. So there are simple practical things that can be done, I think, to improve the grounding, the conversation, if you like, in order to introduce the word that I would use is substantive, just because I don't like the word intrinsic, as if that was a kind of black box that you couldn't look into, but a substantive conversation around the value thing, because you just can't keep discussion of values out, nor should you try, otherwise it just ends up on Twitter and it's really poisoned.
I think that's a really excellent point, where I think when you speak to people in New Zealand and in the arts and cultural scene, and people are, I think, and this is a really terrific moment, where people are going, well, it's great to know what these models are that they use in America or in England and whatever. They're all just cultural constructs from other places. And what I'm seeing and what I get quite excited by is something that Michael King would have been very keen on, where he said, well, we shouldn't be colonised a second time. We must build our own future with our own ingredients at hand. And that means that we just don't take these ideas willy-nilly and cut and paste them and put them here. And so you see a lot of, trusts now are doing things like saying we want minimum provisions to ensure that there's Maori representation. We want minimum provisions to ensure that there's practitioner representation, diversity more broadly, so that we can do, essentially this is what, Maori would say, developing our own kaupapa. No one else can do that for us. Only we can do that ourselves. And it does require a little bit of bravery to kind of cut the ties, because all of our mental maps, nearly all of them, in terms of management, are from overseas. They're not here. So when Te Papa was embarking on its bicultural project in the 1990s, there was nowhere to cut and paste from. It required leadership and authenticity and bravery, and it still does. But as you say, you get fresh value through fresh ideas. And the idea of having, something like Circus Oz, which is founded by practitioners, then becoming a purely corporate managerial entity when it's probably got a charitable purpose anyway, is just slightly perverse.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question?
You can ask anything.
Now's your chance.
I mean, is there anything about the sort of Australian experience that you want to know? Because God knows I've watched that car crash for long enough.
It seems never ending. I've got a loud voice.
Yeah.
It seems never ending. Your charts and going back to 1919.
Yeah.
Everyone has another go at it at some point.
Yeah.
And obviously in Australia from 1970 onwards, what happened in 1970 that made them think we need to make a thing about this?
Yeah. It's really, really interesting. So the last substantial piece of academic work that I did was an article about the 1976 Industry Assistance Commission Assistance to the Performing Arts Report, which is Australia's first real cultural policy document. So it was delivered by what is today called the Productivity Commission. If you ever listen to the Productivity Commission talk, it has not changed what it has said in 50 years. It's always efficiency, it's always consumers, it's always markets. So it delivered this report, and this report is generally regarded as kind of an important moment. So people quarrel about whether it's good or bad, but they kind of go, no, it's important. I thought, who wrote it? You know, who wrote it? It's just like the commission. And I went to look at the two men, and they were middle-aged men who knew nothing about the arts whatsoever. One was a journalist, and the other was a wallboard specialist. And then I also looked at the history of the Productivity Commission in the 70s. So basically, I did what they call a prosopography, which is a background analysis, multi-career analysis of all the commissioners, the 26 commissioners. They were all men. They were all between 35 and 55. 80% of them had economics backgrounds. None of them had any kind of diversity of experience in business or the world. It was a very narrow group of people that captured the ear of the government at that time. They had, however, a very strong alliance with the Australian Financial Review, which was a group of journalists who were all competitive market specialists, you'd have to say that. Not so much kind of News Corps, more, I don't know, you call it semi-libertarian. And it's pretty easy. You don't have to go too far into the history to kind of go the Productivity Commission, the Senior Executive Service, which is the mandarins basically, and the Australian Financial Review. And what they're doing is they're exchanging personnel throughout the 1970s. And what they want is the abolition of tariffs, because they're convinced that tariffs are basically keeping prices too high. And they work on the Labour Party. They don't have to really worry too much about coalition. Their focus is first Gough Whitlam and then later Bob Hawke. Bob Hawke in particular, because throughout the 1970s, Bob Hawke is their number one enemy. Every time the Productivity Commission are trying to get rid of an industry, Bob Hawke is there with his hard hat kind of complaining about it. But in the 1980s, they turn him. And Australia winds back tariffs completely. And I was there on the ground talking to three economists in 2015 in Adelaide when the last car factory closed. And the economist said to me, how can culture replace this? And I was like, it can't. There's no way the creative arts, in whatever passes for your imagination, there is no way that the creative industries can replace what you've done. What you talk about a gaping silence that was kind of crackling in the room. They wound down that car industry. A year later, they were going, we've made a mistake. So, I don't necessarily think that you need to be an expert in, the development of contemporary economic thought or political decisions. But I think it helps to know a bit. This endlessness that you describe, it looks to me, theatre director that I am, and used to the idea of panic, because that's what most rehearsal rooms are like, it looks to me like panic on steroids. One decision after another with these strange hopes. One hope is, and you see it in the literature, that if you wind back tariff-supported manufacturing industries, new industries are just going to happen. They're just going to spring up. And now we're living off our money. So they didn't.
Do you have any follow-up thoughts about that, Stephen?
Well, only really that cultural policy comes from the polis or the city and from the political realm. And I guess that's the inconvenient truth of it. You know, we can do our own policies and that's kind of easy. But influencing the centre, as we call it, is the trick. And you can see in this moment, I guess, in the, you know, with COVID still splendidly amongst us, whilst at the same time the political narrative is, oh no, that's all over now, we're in a new phase. You know, hyperinflation. You know, these are more difficult times than I can recall for New Zealanders in a long time. So I suspect that we need a different angle than the ones we've used historically to get into this value discussion. And I remember one of the case studies that Mark Moore did was around health policy in America. And you might know, because it's always a big thing, and because of the way that we only really hear about American and British news, we know lots about the American politic. And so you probably know that every time the Republican team comes in, they're trying to reduce Medicare or the health policy that affects many Americans, and the blue team's kind of trying to amp it up. And it's this relentless, talk about cycles, you know, it's as sure as day follows night, everything, it's the same thing. And he was talking about George Bush Sr., I think. He'd followed a Democrat cycle, and he went about changing the health policy. And he got all this advice, and some of the advice was, look, we all know that the American health system is 3 times more expensive than the health systems in all these other countries. Look, here's the evidence. You know, if you were to start from scratch, you know, this would be like your 32nd option. It works really well for a small number of people, but for most people it's pretty crap. He said, thanks very much. Thanks for your analysis. Thanks for your advice. And so what did he do? He said, well, we're going to improve the system, but we're going to improve it using a market-based approach. And everyone's going, this is just crazy. You know, here's all the evidence. And he said, so the thing, and then Martin Moore said, the thing that he knew that the people giving him advice didn't register is that politics exists in the realm of treasured beliefs. And this goes to your point. If you've got a consumerist market-driven model where you believe that provides you with all of the answers that you need to have a better society, that is what your policies will reflect. What the facts are is completely irrelevant to people who believe that. And conversely, there are people who believe that if only the government could make more decisions, life for New Zealanders would be better, have the same disease, albeit from a better perspective. But the thing is that the narrative changes depending on which team happens to be in power. And I guess that's the trick that we need to learn to understand, which is what are the treasured beliefs that we can tap into to register and get attention, which has been, I guess, the fatal flaw of the cultural sector, I don't know, probably since forever, unless someone can remember a time when that wasn't the case.
Thanks, Stephen. This is a really rich conversation, and I feel like we should have put aside a whole day for it. But unfortunately, I'm quite conscious that we've only got a certain amount of time in this room, and we want you to be able to enjoy a drink and to mingle and to be able to have follow-up conversations with people. So, and we do have one last panel person who is going to speak to us. Do we still have time to do that, Victoria?
Well, it's 7 o'clock now.
Okay.
So maybe we can send that out. We've got people's contact details, and Kath pre-recorded her response this morning, so I think we can do that via your contact details. So we'll do that. Along with the recording of this lecture. So just bring it up. So that'll come as within a few days.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay.
I want to say just two more things. Yeah. I don't know, because I don't really know. I'm married to a New Zealander, so I should know New Zealand quite well, but I don't really. I don't know the cultural sector. And I have no idea what you'll remember from this, if anything, or if anything's useful. But I suppose there are two things that I think that if I was in your shoes, I would be thinking about. One is who. Not so much the methodology and the what, but who within the system of cultural policy making, which my 6-year-old son used to describe as, he said, really disturbing in a boring kind of way, was his kind of description of the whole of it. But who within that is the swivel, is the pivot. It's like, and I agree with James, it's not going to be the minister. I can tell you that right now. It's going to be someone else. And the other is when. So if not now, then when? Because these things, cultural policy isn't on a flat ground. It's in history, and history is changing. So at any one moment in time, a moment may present itself. And I guess when I'm with my colleagues, I'm thinking, have the narrative ready. Have the narrative ready, because when that moment comes, it's blindingly fast.
Thanks, Julian. I think that's a great statement to finish with, a little bit inspiring. So I'd like to thank our respondents, Stephen, the respondent who is here, and Kath, who has also responded, but who you'll hear from in due course. Kia ora koutou. It's my pleasure now to introduce our next speaker, Catherine Nieses. Catherine has been at the Arts Council England since 2018. Her current role is Director of the Development Agency Change Programme, which focuses on transforming the Arts Council from a grant-giving body that does development work to a development agency that invests in arts and culture through grants and other funding models. Prior to this, she was the Programme Director for the Culture Recovery Fund, which distributed over £2 billion in COVID relief to arts, culture and heritage organisations across the UK. Before moving to the UK, Catherine was a management consultant in Aotearoa, specialising in strategy development, transformation, commercial negotiations and change management projects, working across a range of public, private sector and Indigenous organisations. She's also worked in New Zealand as a senior civil servant across a range of sectors, including arts and heritage, Indigenous issues, justice services, disaster recovery, and economic development. Catherine is going to share with us her insights into arts and culture policy in the UK, which she thinks that would be useful for New Zealand to consider. Thank you, Catherine.
Kia ora tātou. Na mihi atu kia koutou e hui hui mai nei. My name's Kat Nieses. I am talking to you from London, a very dark, wet London evening, and it's a real pleasure and joy to join you in this broad conversation. I feel really privileged and honoured to be part of this. It feels a little bit like coming home in a myriad of senses, coming back to Te Papa, where I started my career a very long time ago when it was still the Museum of New Zealand, coming back to Te Herenga Waka, where I went to university and worked just before I left to come here about 5 years ago. So it's a real joy and privilege to be able to have this conversation and to share my experience from the last few years working here in London. So I am from Ngāti Porou, so I'm a very quiet, retiring woman. And for those of you who can't see me, I have greying, curly hair and wearing glasses and red lipstick and a pink jumper and a black cardigan over the top. So I'm really today going to talk mostly about the Arts Council England's experience stretching from the response to COVID to current environments. I work at the Arts Council. I'm currently the director for the Development Agency Change Program, which is focused on getting the organisation ready to deliver components of our strategy. But prior to that, I was the program director for the Cultural Recovery Fund, which is the fund that the government set up to respond to the pandemic. So I'll start there. You've all lived through COVID, and you know the impact it's had on you and your sector. And here in the UK, the arts and culture sector was one of the sectors of the UK economy hardest hit by the pandemic, where in May 2020, 80% of businesses within the sector had paused or stopped trading. And just prior to that, the Arts Council had established its own emergency response fund, and that was really through reprioritising funding and using all the reserves to get money very quickly out to the sector. And so this $2 billion Cultural Recovery Fund was really aimed to keep the sector and this part of the economy afloat while to just ride out the pandemic. It was really aimed to cover a very short period of time. We were all expecting the pandemic at that stage to be over with very quickly, but of course we all know that's not what happened. And so there were 3 phases of this fund. And through a myriad of investment models, but mostly through grants and loans. So really, really important. I think the key element of this is that it wasn't about reforming or restructuring the sector at all. It was about preserving the sector to enable it to be in a really powerful place when we exited the pandemic. But the reality is current operating conditions are not yet back to normal, and many of those organisations in our sector are really still struggling in a myriad of ways. And with things like, we still have high proportions of people working from home in the UK, and that has consequential impacts on the number of people who are out and about. And audience numbers have still not returned. And of course, international tourism is still well below pre-pandemic levels here in the UK, and not likely to return to those levels until at least next summer. And of course, the other thing that's happened in the last wee while is that the economic headwinds and sector challenges that we now face are significantly different, partly as a result of the pandemic, but not solely. And you too are operating in this context. We know that inflationary pressures, particularly here in the UK, are very high. We're still struggling with supply chain issues, and of course that's impacting things like capital works, but not solely. And labour shortages are really making things really tough here at the moment for those organisations and practitioners in the arts and culture sector. On top of that, we're heading into a winter with really big energy costs, and that's really making people very worried in terms of their ability to continue to operate, especially if you're an arts organisation which is buildings based. And of course, those economic challenges aren't just about organisations and individuals in the arts sector. It's also about those folk who may participate and buy tickets and go to shows and exhibitions and so forth, or sponsor them. So we're really seeing audience levels have, as I said earlier, they're not returning to where they were pre-pandemic, and people are booking later, so the surety of income is not there. And people aren't doing things that they were doing before the pandemic. They're not buying a beer at halftime. They're not buying dinner beforehand or after. So it's really changing people's way that they engage with the arts in a much broader sense. And often those other sources of income are the sources that really supplement the ability of arts organisations to survive. And of course, the last few years have really amplified existing challenges that were already present in much of our sector. So things like socioeconomic and geographic inequalities, unequal opportunities for children and young people, lack of diversity across a broad range of creative industries, and the flexibility and resilience of business models. So, you know, the Cultural Recovery Fund just overlaid on top of those challenges that were inherent in our sector, and the recent economic issues have just amplified those matters. So really a really tough environment for arts and culture at the moment. I think one of the really great things about the Arts Council is that our new strategy that was released in January 2020 really started to pick up these existing challenges because they were there before the pandemic, and really seeks to address those and respond to those. So Let's Create is the Arts Council's latest strategy, so 2020 to 2030. And as I said, it was released in January 2020, and the world changed in March 2020. So we've had a really interesting ride with the implementation of this strategy. And the ambition for the strategy is for England to be a country in which the creativity of each of us is valued and given the chance to flourish, and where everyone has access to a range of high quality cultural experiences. And, you know, it's underpinned by three main outcomes. So that's about creative people, so how the public can engage with and develop their own personal creativity. Creative communities, you know, how professionals and voluntary sectors can work together. And a cultural and creative country, so that looks at the professional cultural sector. So we're really starting to see a shift from supply-led conversations around arts and culture to demand-led, which is a very significant shift. And the strategy is supported by 4 investment principles, which set out how cultural organisations need to develop so they can better deliver our strategy outcomes. And those are ambition and quality, dynamism, importantly, environmental responsibility, and inclusivity and relevance. So that's woven through all of that work in Let's Create. And over the last 3 years, two and a half years, we've been working really hard to bring Let's Create to life. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of examples that really demonstrate that real shift. So building that strategic policy framework, moving it to operations, and then shifting the way we invest and develop across the sector. And so we've just recently completed the National Portfolio and Investment Principles Support program, and that's our main investment program. So it's almost £500 million per annum for the next 3 years, and we're funding 990 organisations through that process. It was the biggest application round for organisations. We received over 1,500 applications, and 276 organisations have been funded for the first time, which is really exciting. One of the principles of this particular round was thinking back to the strategy, was that it was really about ensuring that that spread of funding across England was shifted and was more equitable, and so that places that had been underserved in the past would start to become, they would start to get more funding and more cultural experiences. And so more people can get access, and it's a much, much more representative portfolio. So 148 organisations are majority, so that's 51% Black, Asian and ethnically diverse led. And this is an increase from 53 organisations in the previous round. So you can start to see there's a real shift in the emphasis of where that funding goes. 32 organisations are majority disability led, and 20% more organisations are funded to deliver work for children and young people, with 79% of the portfolio delivery activity is specifically for children and young people. So you can see that policy framework has really influenced and shift where that investment is happening across the country. The reality is, though, there wasn't much more money in the pot to distribute. So that also means that organisations who may not have been able to demonstrate that they could deliver the strategic objectives of the organisation were not funded. And there have been some very large organisations that have had their funding cut or reduced. And that's really set off a very broad conversation about, and London organisations, a really broad conversation about sort of where the emphasis should continue to be in terms of arts funding. So this is one of our most powerful mechanisms in terms of influencing the shape and structure of our sectors around us. The other places that it's really shone for us is we've done this really amazing thing, more colleagues in the organisation have with a youth advisory board. And as part of this, the work to develop Let's Create, we engaged with hundreds of children and young people across England to really understand the role of creativity, sorry, there's a spelling mistake there, in their lives and how we can better support them. And so that's a real indication of sort of getting a strategic framework in place. And as I indicated earlier, that investment in children and young people has really gone up this time round. And one of the key things that's also come out, it's a pilot project, but it's been working really well, is the establishment of a youth advisory board where 18 young people work with our staff, with my colleagues, to ensure the voice of children and young people is at the heart of what we do. And so they provide comment on policy and approaches to implementation of pieces of work alongside developing their own individual skills and knowledge. And it's been a really powerful mechanism. And we've just extended that pilot through to July 2023. The other thing that's really shifted for us is, and it's sort of intimated in terms of our portfolio, is this real emphasis on place and levelling up. And we're really working to tackle socioeconomic and geographic inequalities for cultural opportunity across England. We're prioritising places where we can maximise the impact of our investment and work with government to really drive up investment in places to support the government's levelling up agenda, which is really focused on opportunities outside of London. So for our priority places, we've got 54 places where our current levels of investment and engagement with arts and culture are low. And so we are seeking and using all the levers we've got to increase our investment. But we are, as I indicated earlier, taking that real demand-led. So we're working locally, working with councils and local stakeholders to set bespoke objectives and increasing our staff time and investment across a range of funds, so operating quite differently. And levelling up is a part of the broader government commitment to increasing opportunity across the country. And so we've worked with the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport to identify 109 local authorities outside London to receive additional engagement. And so there was an additional £43 million invested in levelling up for culture places as part of our NPO portfolio. So you can start to see that over time there will be a real shift of emphasis and funding and our energy in terms of the development activities outside of London. It's not saying that the arts offer in London is not important. It's saying that actually we just need to rebalance for the rest of the country. So as I was thinking about this conversation, which is very one-sided because you can't talk to me, and my experience and understanding of the sectors, arts and heritage and culture sectors in New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand, I think there are some really important differences that put Aotearoa New Zealand in an entirely different place to the UK. And I think the size and scale of the sector just creates so much more opportunity for flexibility and agility. Being able to respond very quickly and very locally, I think, is one of the great advantages of the way you work in Aotearoa. And I think, you know, and the age of institutions, I think, is a real benefit. You know, here in the UK, we've got institutions and organisations that have been around for hundreds of years, and that history is a great thing. However, it can calcify ways of doing things, because, you know, we've done that for hundreds of years, and so the ability to kind of shift and move quickly can be quite limited. And the scale of the sector is incredibly huge, and the ability to kind of get shift and momentum is really difficult. And I think those concepts of whakapapa and manaakitanga really are incredibly powerful forces in Aotearoa, which really influence the nature and shape of the work being done, and by whom, you know, for whom and by whom in Aotearoa, which is not as sort of prevalent, and it's certainly not woven through all the work that we do here in the UK. And I can see how in Aotearoa it really provides a real basis for a different kind of relationship and engagement that you can work through time in quite a different way. And I think the other thing, which I haven't written on here, is that, you know, we here are dealing and continuing to deal with the outcomes and the implications of colonialism and empire and slavery, and being able to think about those things in the context of arts, culture and heritage in a way that is open and engaging and enables a broad range of voices to come to the table is a really challenging conversation to have, and being able to do that in a really exciting way, and still uphold space for conversations in the sector. So that's it from me. Hopefully you've heard some good things, and colleagues at Te Papa and Te Ringa Waka will know exactly how to get hold of me. So if you've got any questions and so forth, you can feel free to get in touch. But it's been a real delighting for me, a little bit like coming home on so many fronts. And so you get to hear me rabbiting on for a little while. But ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. Thank you very much.